Evening, guys. We'll get started with our review. First thing I want to check with, though, is if you could help me out, if you are watching at this point, I'm going to check to see if I can flip to one of my desktop screens. And so if you could, please, I'm going to keep talking while I'm at that spot. If you could just let me know through today's meet whether or not the noise still keeps coming through. That'll tell me if I'm able to use some of the images from my desktop to be able to help you guys to understand the material. So we're going to test it out right now. I'm going to keep talking. And as I flip you over to the desktop like this, please let me. So were you able to hear me still keep talking, or what, did I go silent? If one of you can help out with me on today's meet page, that would help out a ton. Awesome. So we'll get started with the review session then. Your test that you'll be taking tomorrow, 50 questions covering 3 chapters, chapters 23 through 25. And like I mentioned, I had one person say I can hear it when somebody else said I went silent. That's definitely not good. Okay, so if you can't hear anything when I went to a new screen, let me see here. If you can't hear anything when I went to a new screen, then we're going to have to avoid doing that. So I've got different ways that I'll be able to do what we're doing tonight. It'll just take me a second to bring up the questions that you guys have posted. Come on now. I'll try this a different way. All right, I'm going to pause you guys for just a second. I'll come right back once I get my computers working so I can get your questions. So we'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right, I think we should be set to go. Sorry about the delay that took place there. I think I'm using way too much bandwidth along with the rest of my kids and everybody else who is working around the house. So let's get started. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into today's meet page, and we'll get rolling. So first of all, there was a question that started off the evening asking about 3 different groups of people: the mugwumps, the stalwarts, and the half-breeds. These 3 individuals are all Republicans, and so when you hear all those terms, it's just terms to describe different Republicans who are feeling differently about reform. With the mugwumps and the stalwarts and the half-breeds, they are divided, especially after Garfield's assassination, because there's a feeling that something should be done with reform, but the stalwarts disagree. The stalwarts are people who want no reform. They don't want any change. They are hardcore conservative Republicans who always want to maintain the status quo that they've always had, allowing the spoils system to take place. The mugwumps are people who are willing to leave the Republican Party because they're so mad about the issue of reform that they're even willing to vote Democrat for Grover Cleveland in order to get reform done. And then you have the mugwumps who are pushing reform. They're the ones who will be pushing for stuff like the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which makes a test for certain civil service jobs inside the government where you have to prove through this test that you are capable of doing minimal math and history and whatever to prove that you can actually hold down a government job. The mugwumps are people who are going to turn against the stalwarts and start pushing to try to create some reform, but they don't want to go as far as the mugwumps. It's the half-breeds are not going to want to go as far as the mugwumps will. So half-breeds want reform, but they're staying Republican. Mugwumps totally want to elect a Democrat to create reform, and stalwarts want no change. The next question that's on my question sheet is asking about the gold standard. And so since I can't jump to another screen, I'll end up having to draw this out for you in a different fashion instead. And so this question has to do with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and the other silver laws that were created during this time period. And so what I want you to consider is imagine the fact that with the gold standard, $1 bill is equal to 1 piece of gold. Now, what's going to be happening as we move off the gold standard into bimetallism once we start playing around with silver, is they're going to start playing around with the idea of also giving a dollar certificate for 16 pieces of silver. So this is the ratio that they set up, and they just set it up as an arbitrary ratio because in the past, historically, 1 piece of gold has been worth 16 pieces of silver, give or take. For us, though, when we play around with metal nowadays, like if you go out to buy a gold ring or a silver ring, it's going to change in value depending on how scarce that metal is at the time. So there are going to be some times that 16 to 1 is a good ratio to have. The key thing to think about is when we think about gold and silver in the late 1800s, you're going to have way more silver that's going to be discovered than you will gold. And so because of that, since there's more silver that's being pulled out of the mines during this time period, silver is becoming less and less scarce. And so if they're actually doing this right, they should be changing the ratio of how much silver you're going to be able to use to get a dollar certificate that's equal to 1 piece of gold. Because what we're going to see during the Panic of 1893 is a bunch of people are going to realize that we're giving away silver, we're giving away dollar bills for too little silver. The best way to think about this is imagine if one day at the bank they created a new program, and what they said is, if you show up to the bank with 50 cents, we'll give you a dollar bill for it. And then you can take that dollar bill and buy a dollar's worth of gold, which is what everybody wants anyways. So the system is a mess, and what should probably be happening is we should probably be taking this amount of silver and kicking up how much silver you need to actually have in order to get a dollar bill. They don't do that. And so we're going to have in the Panic of 1893 a crash, but then also we're going to have a run on gold where all the gold is going to leave the government and it's going to be replaced by a bunch of silver that nobody wants, but we now have to buy because of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. So hopefully that made sense. If that's confusing, I totally understand, so feel free to throw in more questions if you need any help with that. Next question, will we need to know all the railroads' names inside your textbook? No, but the 3 big ones that you should know about are the Union Pacific that's going from Kansas out towards California, the Central Pacific that's coming from California towards the Midwest. And the reason we want to notice those is those are the 2 railroads that make up the Transcontinental Railroad. And we also want to know about the Irish working for the Union Pacific, Chinese working for the Central Pacific, and then also here in Minnesota, the Great Northern Railroad being built by James J. Hill is important because unlike other railroads, it's going to be a railroad that uses no government money or land grants to build itself, and so it's going to be very unique in that fashion. Let me see here. Compromise of 1877. This question is dealing with the election of 1876. It's dealing with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. And in the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, you have Hayes, who is a Republican, and he is going to technically lose the election of 1876. But the reason why is because you're going to have a guy named Tilden, who's the Democrat, who is going to be part of a movement in the Deep South to rig the election. You're going to have a number of Democrats in the South threatening African Americans, taking away their right to vote. There are some election boxes that have obviously been stuffed by a lot of people who are illegally voting in these elections. And so Tilden ends up winning, but most Americans realize that there's been something sneaky that took place. When they put together an election commission to figure out how the election should be ruled, they put together almost the same number of Republicans and Democrats, but there was one more Republican on the commission, which means the Republicans and Rutherford B. Hayes were going to win that commission's decision. The problem is the Democrats in the South weren't just going to accept that lying down, because technically they did win the election, and nothing's been proven 100% that there was corruption. And so the way the Compromise of 1877 works is the Democrats in the South accepted Hayes' election even though they didn't like it, but in return, the Republicans then promised that they were going to end military Reconstruction and pull the soldiers out of the Deep South, ending their Reconstruction efforts. And so this is the Compromise of 1877. It essentially ends Reconstruction. Next question, what is pragmatism and why is it important during this time period? Pragmatism is going to be important strictly from the standpoint that you have people becoming less dogmatic and more pragmatic. And with pragmatism, we talked about with Thomas Jefferson, the idea that you can kind of be flexible in your principles in order to get stuff done. We're especially going to see pragmatism going on with reformers in the late 1800s who, instead of worrying about what the rules have to be, they're trying to reimagine what they can do to make society a better place. So you're going to see this happening with movements like the settlement houses that Jane Addams is going to create, where instead of it being a perfect solution, she's going to buy a mansion in the inner city, in an immigrant neighborhood, and do what she can to affect positive change to help people out. So you're going to see that happening with the progressives as more and more in the early 1900s, they're going to be trying to figure out ways to change America, to reform it in ways that they think is going to improve our country. And they're less concerned about what has to be done, and they're more worried about what can be done in order to make things better. Let me see here. The next question is about realism, naturalism, and regionalism. None of these are going to be hugely important when it comes to an AP US history test. They are all literature terms, so let me give you a brief synopsis of each. Realism is moving away from romanticism, which was the writing style of the mid-1800s, and realism is very much trying to focus on a gritty, realistic look at society as it's being written into the pages of novels or stories, to try to give you something that's not fantastical, superhero-y, like extremely good guy, bad guy. Instead, they want to give you more of a gritty realism that's happening in society. And we're especially going to see that with the writing of muckrakers, where muckrakers are very much going to try to expose the ugly underbelly of a lot of elements of society to try to bring reform movements to start happening. Naturalism is a focus on including nature and the wild into stories, and very much also trying to be realistic with those stories as well. So naturalism and realism aren't that far away from one another, where they're both depending on each other to try to create stories that are less fantastical and more gritty and real. And then finally, regionalism is a story structure that is going to be using elements of a different region inside the country to try to weave that into the story as a major fundamental element. So you'll see stories that are focused on the South or the West, and doing a lot of deep diving into the cultural elements that make those areas distinct from the rest of the country. And we see that very much as an attempt to try to hold on to what makes places regionally different, as the country is becoming more and more homogenous or looking more and more like one another. None of those I'm going to spend a lot of time testing you on, and you won't see a lot of questions on the AP test about them. What were the liberal Republicans, and what did they believe in? The liberal Republicans that we see emerging during this time period are the ones who are looking for reform. These would be your mugwumps, your half-breeds, the people who are pushing for reform inside the party, and they would like to make change happen. And so they're the ones who are pressuring the party to think differently than laissez-faire, hands-off business, like they've done in the past. Let me see, the next question. what is sharecropping? Sharecropping was that simulation that we did when we were studying Reconstruction, where you are a farmer on a plantation and you are farming while you're planning on paying rent. And the rent that you're going to pay is not through money. It's going to be a share of the crops that you've been growing throughout the season. And for sharecropping, this very much starts becoming more and more like slavery, as you've got more and more people being trapped in debt as they're trying to work their way off the plantation. And so for sharecropping, we saw a number of different things going on where the system was set up pretty easily to try to prevent African Americans from getting their freedom. Let me see the next question. Social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is based on the ideas of a couple men, a man named Spencer and a scientist named Charles Darwin, both of whom are working on the idea of evolution and survival of the fittest. And they're looking at that through species, trying to analyze why is it we can find fossils of critters that haven't been around for a while, but there's other animals that are still alive. And their hypothesis is that animals survive and adapt, sometimes through evolution, in order to be able to adjust and continue living. We're going to find that then scientists will latch onto this and they'll start applying this in other different ways. And one of the ways was through social Darwinism, where a number of people in education started playing around with the idea that if this was true for animals, it must be true for human beings as well. And so social Darwinism was the idea that if you become rich, if you become successful, it's not because of luck or advantages or whatever. It's because you are somebody who's genetically better than somebody who is poor. And obviously this philosophy really took off for middle to upper income individuals, because it very much then took away any guilt or concern they should have about any success they have, because according to science, it's just the fact that they're genetically better. We're going to see, though, like I mentioned to you today, the Panic of 1893 is going to bring social Darwinism down quite a bit, as many Americans who once believed they were on the positive side of social Darwinism will then find themselves unemployed, and they will suddenly not be too receptive to the idea that they are part of the lazy class that can't get ahead, because they realize they've been working hard and they get swept up in a crash that really doesn't have anything to do with them being at fault. It's more just the system rolls them up. And so more and more of them will be willing to listen to other people going away from social Darwinism. The next question asks about, let me see, the Sherman Antitrust Act and pools. And so let's take a look at what that stuff is first of all. So when we think about monopolies, first of all, I highlighted the idea that if you ever see a person like a monopoly owner who then has a lot of tentacles going out to various businesses, this is meant to be a metaphor for a monopoly. Now, this monopoly is, mono means one, and so monopoly is one person owning all the businesses in a certain field or function. So when it comes to oil, that's going to be John D. Rockefeller, who has a monopoly in oil. When it comes to steel, it's Andrew Carnegie. Banking is J.P. Morgan. Cornelius Vanderbilt with railroads. But what's going to start happening is in the late 1800s, there's going to be people pushing for anti-monopoly laws. You saw that with Munn versus Illinois, where states started making monopolies on railroads illegal, as far as like not being able to jack up rates extremely on farmers when they were using the railroads. And so some of the monopoly owners started getting crafty, and what Rockefeller is going to do is he is going to create his Standard Oil Trust. And so what he's going to do is he's going to build a trust company right in the middle of his monopoly, and instead of him being the owner of all of the companies down here, he's going to give all these companies to the trust to own, and it's going to have a board of trustees that's doing all the management of his company for him. Rockefeller then is going to become the owner of the trust company that owns all of his businesses. So while it's kind of gamey and everybody understands he still owns all of his businesses, technically he doesn't. Technically, he is no longer the sole owner of all of these businesses. He is the owner of a trust that owns all of these businesses. Now, when he starts selling stock in this company, in his trust to other people, then you've got a bunch of other people who are part owners of the Standard Oil Trust, and so it's not technically a monopoly anymore. Now, the Sherman Antitrust Act was an attempt to make people believe that there's something being done to reform this, but it's being created during the Gilded Age. So when you read about the Sherman Antitrust Act, don't get confused. This is not a legit attempt to try to root out all the monopolies in the United States. It's being done by politicians to make it look like they're doing something, when in actuality they're creating gigantic loopholes for these guys to be able to fit through when it comes to antitrust law. So the way the Sherman Antitrust Act works is it says that if there is a business that is inhibiting trade because they have a monopoly on business, then they're in violation of antitrust law and they must be broken up. We're going to find, though, that in the court case E.C. Knight versus the United States, there's going to be a sugar trust that owns 98% of all the sugar sales in the United States, but because they don't own 100% and they're not shutting off the supply of sugar, they don't qualify as a trust, and so they're not going to be broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it's something where it seems like they're trying to do something, but they're not really on board to do much of anything. Now, the two other terms that we want to be able to notice, the first one is going to be known as pools. And so imagine if we have 4 different oil companies competing against each other. J.P. Morgan is the guy who's arguing that we should not be competing. There should be cooperation and efficiency. So what a pool is going to be is all of these companies, 1, 2, 3, 4, are going to all get together and they're going to create a pool where they're going to say, in this market, imagine this is the Minneapolis area, all 4 of these companies are going to agree that this is the price that they're going to sell their stuff for, and they're not going to get into a price war with one another, so they can all make cash and be able to sell their oil or steel or whatever without disruption. That's essentially called pooling, and that's seen as being illegal, where these guys are essentially preventing any competition outside of their group because they're setting then the rules for them to be able to stay in business and keep everybody else out. Another thing that's happening during this time period is called holding companies. And so you're going to have companies that are built in like low tax states like New Jersey, and what they're going to do is they're going to be buying up a whole bunch of different businesses that are part of their monopoly, and they're going to be trying to hold them in a different place. So you can have a trust that is also connected to a holding company, and they can also have a board of directors that could be on a bunch of other board of directors. So you're going to have the same small pocket group of people owning these big businesses and creating rules that are confusing to try to stop any sort of antitrust laws from going into effect. For us, for tomorrow, though, the key thing we're going to want to be able to know about is monopolies, trusts, and then the attempts to try to break them up. And understanding that there are holding companies and interlocking directorates will be good. But if you're still kind of sketchy, there isn't going to be a lot of questions about them, and we'll be dealing with them more when we start breaking up monopolies. Let's see, the next question, what is yellow journalism? Yellow journalism can be used in one of 2 different ways. The first way is that yellow journalism was used in your textbook to describe any of the newspaper printing that's happening on cheap yellow paper that's being sold in really cheap newspapers to sell all these sensational stories out to the country. Yellow journalism, more specifically, though, is going to be used to describe the type of sensationalist journalism, exaggerated tabloid sort of journalism that is going to be about foreign policy that will drag us into the Mexican-American War. And so we're going to hear more about that later. But the term itself is just describing the rise of cheap newspapers that is very much trying to be sensationalistic to get people to buy more. Let me see here. What are the importance of Edward Bellamy and Mark Twain? Not much when it comes to this test. For both of them, they are authors that are famous in the late 1800s. Mark Twain is a satirist, and so he is somebody who is making fun of the corruption and scandals and other sorts of hypocrisies that are going on in the late 1800s. Edward Bellamy is writing he's writing novels that very much get into the ideas of socialism and reform, and so he's able to take off as an author for that. For each of them, though, I don't see a ton of stuff on the AP test that's going to be important for us, and I can guarantee that on the test tomorrow there will not be a lot of time devoted to either of those 2 authors. Let me see. I've already covered the Pendleton Act. What was the reason for trust companies? I'm assuming that was good, understanding that the trust companies are being built to try to evade anti-monopoly laws, and so they're building these trusts to try to figure out ways to get around the anti-monopoly laws of the mid-1800s, and then the antitrust laws will come later. Next question, what is the American Federation of Labor? You have two different labor unions that you need to know about specifically from this chapter. One is the Knights of Labor. This is your first more radical major union inside the United States. They take in both skilled and unskilled workers. They are very much going to be more radical in their tactics and their ambitions that they would like to achieve from their bosses. And they're going to go away with the Haymarket Riot, when they're going to be seen as being similar to anarchists who drop a bomb into a group of police officers at that strike. And so the Knights of Labor will go away in the 1880s. The American Federation of Labor, though, is only going to accept skilled workers, and they're going to be pushing for less ambitious demands, but more what they call bread and butter issues of like better wages, better work weeks, better safety conditions. And they're more hesitant to strike and protest than the Knights of Labor were. They will strike, but they very much do not want to be seen as the radicals who are being seen as being dangerous and are being linked to nativism as well. Next question. What was the People's Party and what did they believe in? The People's Party is the same as the Populists. And so these are the farmers that were very angry about what was happening in the late 1800s, especially in the Panic of 1893. Their most important issue is they're worried that farmers are going bankrupt because they borrowed too much money to buy the machines that their farms needed, and their prices are dropping because of deflation, whether it's us being on the gold standard or high tariffs or a whole host of other things going on with competition issues. These farmers are finding themselves desperately poor, and they're hoping to add silver to the money supply to inflate the price of their food, that they will then be able to earn more money and be able to pay off their debts easier. The Populists also wanted things like to break up the monopolies on railroads, to directly elect senators, and to do a bunch of other different things that are meant to be reforms of the political system, because they feel like politicians are being rigged by big businesses. And they very much feel like the little guys who are being picked on by the elites. So when we hear about, like last year with President Trump's election, that some people describe it as a populist uprising, they're thinking back to this time period where you had farmers who very much felt like they were being picked on by the elites and the well-to-do, and they're very much seeing this movement as a way to try to help even the playing field. Let me see. Can I describe the muckrakers? Muckrakers are really simple. These are authors who are writing stories about the evils that they're seeing inside society. Like one of the famous books by Frank Norris is called The Octopus, where he is going to write a book called The Octopus about the rise of monopolies. And it's going to be a sensationalistic book where he's going to make it sound as bad as possible, so that the people that he's writing about won't be referred to as captains of industry. He wants them known as robber barons. We're going to study a book coming up over the next few weeks called The Jungle, where a writer, Upton Sinclair, is going to be writing about how ugly the situation was inside of the meat packing plants. So these authors are going to be writing about scandals, and they're going to try to write in the most extreme, sensational way possible to convince people that reform is now needed. Let me see here. The next question. Two things. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, that's a last attempt by the radical Republicans before the end of Reconstruction to protect African Americans in the South and their rights, and especially to prevent segregation happening with Jim Crow laws and black codes. By this point, though, the military has largely lost control of the Deep South, and so this law, while it was passed, it was pretty much a dead law where nobody in the South was obeying this law because there's nobody to enforce this law. The other thing, the McKinley Tariff Act is named after William McKinley, the soon-to-be president of the United States, and William McKinley's Tariff Act is going to be a law put into place to try to increase protective tariffs. Now, the reason why this is controversial is we've had a number of people suggest that we needed higher tariffs. Alexander Hamilton did that, and he was arguing that we needed to do that to protect our teeny tiny little businesses from British competition. Henry Clay argued the same thing for the same reason, that after the War of 1812, with his American system, we needed higher tariffs to protect our little businesses against European competition. Abe Lincoln did the same during the Civil War, because if we were in competition with the Europeans, that could then cause economic damage to the North and unemployment and whatever. Your problem, though, is with the McKinley tariff. It's one of the highest tariffs ever in U.S. history, and it's incredibly protective, but it's protective of a country that now doesn't have little teeny tiny businesses. We have gigantic, massive businesses, and they don't really need protection. They just really love protection, and so they're very much going to be pushing the government to try to help them out. And so this is where you get into a tricky spot, where we want to say that in the late 1800s, government was laissez-faire, which means hands-off business. But we're going to see incidents like that, and then also like using the military to break up strikes or giving away land or railroads out west, or a whole host of other sorts of things that you've seen through the scandals and whatever, where when it comes to handouts, the government is definitely giving some to the corporations in the late 1800s, but many business owners are saying that this is good because they're the job providers who are helping out with our economy. For many people who are going to be reformers then coming up soon, they're going to argue that we're telling poor people that they should get no help from the government, because if they do get help, they'll be lazy and whatever. But we're also giving a different message to corporations who are getting an awful lot of help from businesses, and tariffs are one of those. Let me see here. Two questions are here. One's about the City Beautiful movement. The City Beautiful movement is an attempt during the late 1800s to address the issue that's going on where as cities are building outwards, they're turning into grungy, dirty, ugly places. And especially they seem very far away from nature. And so when you read about how naturalism becomes a huge thing in literature, a lot of that's happening because kids inside the inner city have very little positive to look at with interactions with nature. And so this is one way to provoke that sort of connection. Another way is going to be with many different artists and landscapers and city planners who start building urban parks and green spaces inside the cities to try to provide an oasis inside the cities. And so places that are famous for that, you will have Central Park in New York, you'll have Boston Common in Boston, Massachusetts, and here in Minneapolis we have a few different places. We've got a number of different cemeteries in downtown Minneapolis that are built for that purpose of trying to create a green space. We have a bunch of hidden city parks all throughout St. Paul. And if you ever go to Theodore Wirth Park, it's part of a city plan that was created by one of the planners of the Eastern landscaping, Olmsted, who is going to try to create that green space sort of feel for Minneapolis. And so it's very much a wave that takes off to try to make these more appealing, more naturalistic than they have been previously. The World's Columbian Exposition is a gigantic World's Fair that happens in 1893 in Chicago to show off all the new technological innovations that America is now famous for. It's a great example for the Gilded Age, where while you have thousands of people buying train tickets and buying admission to go in and check out this gigantic extravaganza that's happening in Chicago, where they've got a man-made city south of downtown Chicago. If you ever go down to the Chicago Institute, let me see, not Chicago Institute of Art, their Museum of Science and Technology. It's the last remaining building of what was going on with the Columbian Exposition. But they built a whole huge city down there, complete with artificial waterways and canals that you can travel by boat through, and it's meant to show off for the world how advanced America is. At the same moment, though, just a few miles away in Chicago, you've got a bunch of unemployed people because they're suffering from the Panic of 1893. So it's very much a have and have not sort of situation that's taking place. Let me see here. What was the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act? Pendleton Act is going to be by
Where's the check?
45. Okay. Pendleton Act is going to be a law created after Garfield's assassination that is going to say that if you want to get certain government jobs, you can't just be given the job. You must pass a test to prove that you have basic minimal skills to be able to do that job without being thoroughly corrupt and thoroughly inept. And so this is an early attempt at trying to create civil service reform so that we have less of an abuse of the spoils system. The final question I see here are the Sherman Silver Purchase Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the same thing. The Sherman Antitrust Act, they're both written by the same guy, a guy named Sherman from Ohio, who's a major politician during the time period. Sherman Antitrust Act, though, is dealing with this, trying to figure out ways to break up monopolies or trusts, but it's also being written with the assistance of business so that they're able to make sure that the law has tons of loopholes that they'll be able to jump through. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act creates this, where we have an agreement to be buying a bunch of silver from mines out west, like the Comstock lode out in Nevada that finds a massive vein of gold, a vein of silver. They're going to start buying silver to try to make themselves. Republicans will try to do that to make themselves look like they're friends with the farmers, but they're going to create this ticking time bomb that will make the Panic of 1893 even worse by using silver as a monetary standard when nobody else is. I don't see any of the questions, so I'm assuming we're good. For you guys, good luck with your studying tonight. I hope it goes great. I hope the last test that you take for first semester, chapter test-wise, puts you into a good spot. I'll be around before school tomorrow, though, and so if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. But I don't see any of the questions coming in, and so I'm assuming that we're done. So good luck tonight, and I'll see you tomorrow.